Oh hey everybody, it's Pam, one of the naturalists from the Ecoforestry Institute. Do you know that song I was just humming? It's called The Holly and the Ivy, and it's a really popular Christmas carol. But you know, holly and ivy have a bit of a complicated relationship with our forests on Vancouver Island. Even though they're beautiful Christmas plants that people plant in their garden, they're invasive and they can actually outcompete our native species and cause some harm in our forests. So I'm going to go find Kali and we're going to take you on an adventure at Wildwood to remove some of these invasive species and learn a little bit more about them. And maybe we'll improve this Christmas carol as we do it. A native plant is a plant that belongs in an ecosystem. It's always grown here. It wasn't introduced by humans.
An example of some native plant species that we have here are the sword fern, the red cedar, and this grand fir right here.
An exotic species is a species that doesn't belong in an ecosystem, but it also doesn't harm the ecosystem or change how the plants and animals in that ecosystem interact with each other. A lot of our garden plants are exotic species. Things like this camellia that is growing here by the side of the homestead at Wildwood, and it's not spreading anywhere or doing anything harmful. It just looks pretty. An invasive species is an exotic species that isn't very nice to the ecosystem where it lives. An exotic plant is considered invasive when it starts to outcompete native species and throw the ecosystem into disarray. An example is this Himalayan blackberry that's taken over this entire hillside, outcompeting native species that would like to grow here.
English ivy is an invasive species that was brought over during colonial periods because, of course, it looks nice. But since it's brought over, it grows as dense mats on the ground, which smothers out native plant species, which we don't like. And it is also known to climb up big cedar trees and Douglas fir, like this one right here. Some tips for identifying English ivy are the vine, obviously, but the leaves have these lobes, and sometimes they have 3 and sometimes they have 5, and they also have this glossy appearance as well. And so there aren't a lot of native species that grow on trees like the English ivy does, but we do have our native honeysuckle species, so just double check before you rip anything off of our trees. And some of the ways to get rid of these that are growing up the tree like this is to cut them right at the base, which is what I will attempt to do right now. Done.
Awesome.
Another way to do it is, if they're growing in dense mats on the ground, is to take a lawnmower and just mow it right down to the ground a couple times a year. And if nothing seems to be working, you can always resort to white vinegar. And you just pour a little bit of that at the base of the plant where the roots go into the ground, and that is the perfect weed killer.
And one of the things about the ivy, and the holly too, is that they're evergreen species. This means they can grow during the winter. That's one of the reasons that they're chosen as Christmas plants, because they're still green and beautiful at Christmas time. But what this does is it gives them an unfair advantage over some of our native plants that aren't able to grow here during the winter. Kali, do you think we can find some holly if we look?
I definitely think we have a good chance of finding some, Pam.
All right, let's go see what we can find. Holly, like ivy, was also introduced from Europe. And like ivy, it's evergreen and can grow all year round. It also grows fairly well in low light conditions, which gives it an advantage in our dark forests. When you're trying to identify holly, one of the most important things is not to get it mixed up with our native species, Oregon grape. If you look at these two, there's some basic differences. The Oregon grape looks a lot more organized than the holly. The holly leaves are kind of wavy, whereas the Oregon grape leaves are flat. You can see the Oregon grape leaves are neatly alternated on the stem, whereas the holly leaves grow every which way.
holly is notoriously known as a water hog because it soaks up all the existing moisture and steals it from other plants. It also changes the nutrient chemistry within the soil around it, so it benefits itself and harms the other native plants around it. If you want to get rid of something this size, the best way to do it is to grab it at the base here and then just yank it out. Let's see if I don't get spiked.
Now, maybe you're wondering why we have these invasive species at Wildwood. They weren't planted here, but they traveled here because birds really like those tasty red berries on the holly. Birds eat the berries, poop out the seeds, and you end up with holly and ivy being spread all throughout forests, parks, and other natural areas in bird poop.
People are working hard to prevent invasive species from gaining more land, and you can too. By planting native species instead of invasive ones, that's one way to help. And you can also help by participating in the replanting of indigenous species and the removal of invasive species as well.
Yeah. And definitely don't buy holly or ivy this Christmas. So what do you think? Can we do a better version of that carol now?
I think we can, Pam.
Okay, are you ready?
Yeah. The holly and the ivy are invasive species of all the plants here at Wildwood. We are the least fond of these. The holly bears a berry which is eaten by birds. Ha ha ha, and then the seeds are spread through their little birdie turds.
The ivy comes from England, where it climbs castle walls. But now in BC, it climbs cedar trees, and we don't like that very much at all.
The holly and the ivy
Are invasive without a doubt, and that is why when we see these plants,
we pull them out.
Thanks everybody, we'll see you in the next video.
Bye.